Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paolo Carozza, for your presentation. Very thick, but fortunately we have the paper, so what you couldn't explain by word now, everybody can read in the paper. The floor is open. Professor Hostle, ask the Twitter, please.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for a splendid presentation. My question is a historical question. I certainly agree with you that there is a very different approach to human rights, where we think that human rights are the implementation of a certain objective value orders, or where we understand them as the result of procedural coming together of people who agree on the political process. Now, as you perhaps know, my own philosophical position, and I think that the philosophical arguments are cogent, is of course in favor of the objective order. But I agree with you that one of the norms of the objective order is that there must be some place for the individual process and practices that constitute laws. The question I have with regard to the philosophical, to the historical dimension is this. Within the history of the United States constitutionalism, of course, we had already the debate, because the abolition of slavery was understood by the federal government during the Civil War as the imposition of an objectively right principle against the self-determination of the southern states, while the southern states resented the imposition of something which came from outside and did not correspond to the southern way of life and the southern tradition, the peculiar institutions that had developed over centuries. And so within the United States, the triumph of the objective order, the top-down procedure of laws, triumphed with the victory of the Union against the Confederacy. My question is, why is it so difficult for many Americans to make the transition from this principle to the international level? And here my suspicion is that it is more connected to American exceptionalism than you suggest in your analysis. Many Americans say, okay, if it were so that the international arena was more likely to produce an objective order of substantive justice, we could accept it, but we are simply more enlightened, better educated than most nations on the world, and therefore we cannot accept this transnational regime of human rights because it's not likely to produce a superior objective order to what we have implemented in the United States itself. So you are the expert of constitutional law and of American history, but given the debate within the United States, I think that this part of the answer should be considered in trying to explain the tension in the United States.
Thank you, Vittorio. Please.
Thank you very much, Vittorio, especially because it allows me to bring up some of the points which time prevented me from drawing out of the paper. So first of all, with respect to your observation about the objective philosophical foundations, well, yes, I mean, I think especially those of us who approach this question from the perspective of the social tradition of the church, we can't help but agree, right? That there's this universal objective orientation that's rooted in our universality of the way that we were created as children of God, in Imago Dei, right? But precisely for the reasons that Cardinal Kasper was emphasizing in his introduction, those universal principles are abstract and need to be lived out concretely in the person, and the person in the community in which she lives, the relationships that she has. And that is going to take different forms in different places. It will not be identical or uniform in every place, and it ought not to be, precisely in order to take into account the concreteness of the historically situated person living in time, in history, and not separated from this. So that's where I think the tension comes out between the two. Now, with respect to the way that this plays out in the United States, so I don't, first of all, I don't disagree at all that in the United States there has been, and which is why I suggested at the end, I would be quite critical if I were just focused on US history and its own problems, of the American dispensation often overemphasizing the self-government aspects at the expense of, and the history of our sordid history of the problem of race in the United States is exactly the prime exhibit in that, right? Which is why there needs to be a relationship and a dialectical tension between the pull of the objective order values and the emphasis on self-government and participatory participation in the good, right? Rather than simply a recognition of it. How would we realize that more in an American framework? Well, to point to exceptionalism by itself, I think begs the question, because it says, where does the exceptionalism come from and what feeds it? And partly what feeds it are things like geography, the lack of language, the lack of proximity to other peoples, economic power, which allows us to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world and so forth. But one of the factors that feeds it is also the distance and ineffectiveness of the international political community, right? It is not felt as relevant to the intimacy of the life of the people in the communities in which they live. And that gap is the one that I'm trying to point out that we need to be attentive to. Because if that gap is not seen as a problem of the international, not merely a problem of the local, then it will only serve to create conditions that will allow nationalism to veer from healthy forms to more destructive forms.
Thank you. Professor Buttiglione.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I wish to compliment my friend Paolo for his wonderful exposition that gives really a lot of food for thought. I have made many observations in my notes. The first one regards one problem. Do men have a right to have a nation? And do nations have rights? Because I think that perhaps we should think of human rights not as a set of doctrines, but rather as a way of argumenting and as the place in which different ideas of man are contrasted with one another, and they strive towards realization. And this realization can be different in different human nations and human civilizations. And human rights acquire their form through history. This means, I remember Rosmini, a great Italian philosopher, who spoke of the modality of rights. The fundamental rights are the same for all. St. Thomas says something similar. But there is a nature given by God and a second nature created by man on the basis of the original nature given by God. And this second nature can be different from one place to another place. And they strive towards a common end. But in this moment of their historical development, they can be very different from one another. The second observation is based not so much on St. Thomas, but on the one hand on von Hayek, and on the other hand on the American tradition of the economic jurisprudence. I have been a politician, and a politician has a limited set of resources and a potentially infinite number of rights. And you must allocate resources to rights. And von Hayek says a right is a pretension, and it is not defined until you define who is the carrier of the corresponding obligation. And the way in which you articulate this depends on the politics of different countries. The third observation arises from the traditional position of international law. International law can determine who is right and who is wrong, but does not determine who has the right to enforce the law. Who has the right to enforce international law? Who has the right to enforce human rights? We know that today, the more powerful nations, the great power, they pretend for themselves this right. And they use this right selectively. Nobody will really try to enforce human rights against China. But we did enforce human rights against Iraq. Why?
Thank you. Please.
Right.
We have two more questions.
I'll try to be very, very synthetic. So on the first one, is there a right to a nation? Do nations have rights? So I would say a qualified yes to both of those in this sense. Certainly, and again, for the reasons that His Eminence Cardinal Kasper helped to lay out for us at the very beginning of our dialogue, it is structurally a part of the human person to belong to something greater, starting with the family and the patria. And that is an essential part of human flourishing, to do so, to not be separated from those constitutive communities in which our good is realized. Now, whether that is called a nation or not is then the way in which I'd say it's conditional, right? It need not be a nation as such, but in some way these larger communities of meaning and flourishing are an essential part of what human dignity requires, right? And secondly, do nations on the first point, that is why, in fact, in the positive law of international human rights, there is a recognition to nationality, the right to nationality, right? And the problem of a nationality is viewed as a very serious problem. It's the problem that separates us from the capacity to have rights and to belong to a political community in which our good can be more effectively realized. Secondly, well, do nations have rights? Certainly St. John Paul the Great thought so and said so consistently, right? He would speak of the rights of nations, great and small, just as the UN Charter does. And so in that limited sense, but again, I think it's a conditional right? It is not that that those rights have to take the form of the nation state as such. That's a historically contingent accident. But it is suggestive of the fact that it is fundamental to human flourishing to have rights be recognized at a larger communal level of those communities in which our flourishing emerges and we experience that sense of belonging which is constitutive of our natures. Secondly, well, on the allocation of resources, that's exactly one of the points I try to make but skip over, which is affirmed I think so succinctly by Amartya Sen, of the way in which political rights and political participation and the deliberative aspects of democracy are very closely related to the realization of fundamental rights of human dignity, right? Because there are difficult decisions always to be made in finite circumstances. And finally, well, who has the right to enforce? I would welcome, Mr. President, a future plenary on the question of the legitimacy and effectiveness of the international institutions of global governance, because I think it's a very grave problem. Of course, it's a problem on the one hand that powerful nations seem in some senses free to be unaccountable to international institutions, while weaker nations are subjected to them sometimes even too rigorously. But it's also a problem that the international institutions themselves sometimes lack internal legitimacy because of the failure to make decisions that are effectively oriented towards the common good of the global community.
Thank you, Paolo. Professor Mazzucchelli.
We heard in the first presentation of the Cardinal Kasper that when France established the Declaration of Human Rights in 1789, so that there was no idea to apply this declaration to the colonies. We are talking on the history on human rights, also for the institutions which should protect human rights in the world, but we have never mentioned communism. And I think that's very important in this sense that we can discuss the whole concept of human rights a very utopian way. So the whole system of human rights, also United Nations organizations, was organized in such a way that there were two values, human rights and peace. And peace was always more important. So in my country, the first document on human rights, which I could bought, was the Helsinki document, late 70s. The whole concept of human rights was forbidden, even to discuss and to teach on it. Today also you have China in the Security Council. So could you say a few words concerning this controversy between those two values, human rights versus peace. So, and we know that only once United Nations legitimated the use of force, and this was Afghanistan. That's concerning the legitimate use of force. So it happens only once in the whole history of United Nations. So please, if you can say a few words on this maybe contradictory values, human rights and peace.
Thank you, Piotr. Please.
Thank you, Father Amazurkutz. Well, certainly the post-war UN order absolutely prioritizes security and stability, peace in a very narrow technical sense, over the realization of human rights. And it does so in a way that privileges functionally state sovereignty in doing so, right? So it bars interference in the internal affairs of states and prohibits aggression and so forth. And human rights are subordinated, buried in the apparatus as secondary concerns. But I think the interesting development over 70 years is that once you enshrine human rights into the international sphere, so eventually reaching Poland in the 1970s, nevertheless, it begins to fragment the idea of sovereignty. It begins to erode the classical idea of sovereignty. The problem is we don't really have, in my view of the problem is we don't really have adequate structures to manage the relationship between states with a limited or conditional sovereignty and the international order. Now, from the perspective of the social tradition of the church, subsidiarity is exactly the right principle. But how do we translate it then into institutional realities and practices is the challenge. But I would think that subsidiarity allows us to capture the intimacy of the good of individual human persons, which human rights is oriented towards, and also the substantive value of peace at a large structural global level, which is necessary to the universal common good.
Thank you, Paolo. The last question by Anna Marta. The microphone.
Okay, thank you. It's related to your last point. You mentioned that international institutions and international order is not perceived as relevant because it's perceived as distant from the practical, ordinary life of people. However, in our times, which are times of globalization, we all perceived at a very practical level the effects and the consequences of globalization in the labor market, in the pollution, and many aspects which really touch on our practical life. So it seems as if there is an asymmetry between our current political culture at the national level and the global problems which, being real, are not sufficiently present in the political debate at the national level. So there is a need, an increasing need, I would say, to improve our political cultures at the national level so that they include those topics, because otherwise you will never get the practices necessary to support an international order. But my concern is that we don't really see that in our countries. We are still focused on a very nationalistic and self-contained discourse on very local problems. We have just had elections in Spain, and there was not a word about global.
Thank you. Last words.
I certainly agree, and I guess very, very briefly, I would say though that the response, the adequate response, in my view, has to be one that can't be limited to law. I mean, here, precisely as a jurist, I want to acknowledge the structural limitations of my own discipline, right? The formality of legal institutions and legal norms won't be the ones that generate that kind of awareness and solidarity that is necessary to bring communities to be committed to a more universal common good. That has to happen through education, through politics in the broadest, thickest Aristotelian sense of a process of persuasion of each other in reason towards charity through dialogue. It's in those fields that we can generate the kind of ethical commitment to these goods. And it's one of the reasons why one of the greatest things that law can do, I believe, at the global level to do this, is to foster, and this, as the magisterial teaching has made clear for decades, to foster the centrality of religious liberty. Because it is in the protection of religious communities that we can find the locus of the kind of generativity of the moral and ethical commitments that we need in our communities to foster a universal common good.
Thank you. We are a bit behind, but we have a very lively session. And now the floor is Professor Marcelo Suarez Orozco. Immigration and the state is the topic that is going to present now. Thank you, Marcelo.